Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Committee for Justice's webinar, an overview of Judge Justin Walker's nomination to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm Ashley Baker. I'm Director of Public Policy at Committee for Justice, and I'm here with my colleague, Kurt Levy, who is President of the Committee for Justice. So Kurt's going to take a few minutes to give an overview of Judge Walker and his qualifications and of the D.C. Circuit, and then after that, we're going to have kind of a bit of a discussion about it, and then we'll leave the floor open for a while at the end for Q&A. A couple of housekeeping things. So because this is a public webinar, just like any public event would be, it is on the record, just to keep that in mind. Also, there's a Q&A function in the Zoom platform. If you'd like to send me any questions that you have via that portal, instead of me having to activate your video and audio, you can do that. It is a lot easier, and I'll keep that open during the entire presentation. So Kurt, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. I guess, let's start with some background on the DC Circuit. It's the often said, and I think undoubtedly true, that it's the second most important court in the nation after the Supreme Court. It determines, or I should say, hears many of the cases that determine, how much power the president and the executive branch have, determines the relationships between the three branches. Another sign of its importance and of the quality of judges that serve on it is that I believe 4 of the current 9 Supreme Court justices were nominated for the court while serving on the Supreme Court. Ginsburg, Kavanaugh, Roberts, Thomas, and and Scalia also came from the DC Circuit. I guess another indication of the circuit's importance is that Reed was willing to abolish the judicial filibuster in order to get nominees to the DC Circuit confirmed in 2013. Now, that's turned out to be not such a smart move. I'd say it's turned out to be a bad move. Even if he couldn't have stopped Gorsuch had the judicial filibuster remained, they might well have been able to stop Kavanaugh. They might be able to stop Walker. Now, without the judicial filibuster, they're not going to be able to stop Walker. But despite all those risks, and Reed knew those were risks, the DC Circuit was so important, and gaining control of it was so important that, Reed was willing to take those risks. Because of the it's because of the importance of the DC Circuit more than anything else that Senate Democrats and their allies were already fiercely attacking Walker, for things that have nothing to do with him in some cases, such as saying that Republicans should be focusing on COVID-19 and not judicial hearings. And we can get into all those attacks if you want later. But regardless of what happens here, it's still going to be 7-4 in the DC Circuit. 7 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and that's despite the fact that earlier in his presidency, Trump appointed Naomi Rowe and Greg Katsas. And again, if Walker's confirmed here, it's not going to make a difference because he's replacing Thomas Griffith, who was appointed by Bush. Just an interesting historical note, Griffith was nominated when Eric Estrada, when Estrada dropped out after the Dems had filibustered him for 2 years. That was very controversial, especially when a memo was leaked showing that the reason the Democrats were trying so hard to block Estrada is because they feared he would be the first Hispanic on the court. I guess the bottom line here is it's really hard to shift the balance on circuit courts these days because judges on these courts have become like Supreme Court justices. They time their retirements so that they'll be replaced by a president of their party. So despite all the fuss that Democrats are making about the Walker nomination, it's not going to shift the balance on the DC Circuit. Really, Walker is the perfect person for the DC Circuit, not just because of his brilliance, and brilliance is a particularly important quality on this court, but just if you look at the issues that he's focused on in his scholarship, administrative law, separation of powers, national security, those are exactly the issues that come before the DC Circuit typically. And, you know, people have said, but he's not from DC. Well, forget the fact that DC is a very small area, but, you know, because of this circuit's importance and because it has, you know, great intellectual challenge, presidents often look far and wide to find the very best legal minds in the country. They don't limit themselves to the DC area. And that's the case here with Walker, who spent most of his legal career in Kentucky. Another criticism is, you know, people say that Walker is young. He is relatively young, still under 40, and that, of course, being under 40, he doesn't have decades of experience. But, you know, what's amazing to me is how quickly, you know, this young guy has established himself as a highly respected and brilliant legal mind. He was even, you know, Forbes picked him to be one of the 30 under 30 in the law and policy category. I mean, this guy has just, again, been an intellectual superstar from the beginning. You know, he graduated magna cum laude. That's very hard to do from Harvard Law School. And that was after graduating summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from Duke University. He then went on to clerk for Kavanaugh when he was still in the DC Circuit, Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court. And, you know, I mean, I also went to Harvard Law School, and I can tell you it's not by any chance easy, even going to Harvard Law School, that you get a DC Circuit clerkship and a Supreme Court clerkship. It's very much the exception, even coming from those top schools. You know, then before he became a judge, he was a tenure track professor at University of Louisville at their law school there. And again, it's not easy. Very hard. I mean, he was a conservative, very hard for conservatives to get tenure track jobs at any law school. You know, he was great at scholarship while he was there. And, you know, despite the fact that he's put a lot of many hours into his legal career, he's also had time for volunteer work. You know, he spent 6 years as the unpaid executive director of a nonprofit for disadvantaged school kids. Look, the real reason that the Democrats don't like him is because he has a conservative judicial philosophy. He's not apologetic about it. He believes in textualism and originalism, i.e., he doesn't believe in injecting his policy preferences into decisions the way that Democrats and their allies on the left typically do. He's a big believer in enforcing the Constitution's structural constraints, such as the separation of powers, federalism, you know, other limits on government power. I like the way Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, summed it up. He said, and I'm going to read you the quote here. He said, "Justin Walker is a brilliant and fair jurist who reveres the Constitution and our nation's founding principles. He understands the crucial but limited role that a judge must play in our constitutional order." And again, that's exactly it. A judge should play a limited role of interpreting the law, be it Constitution or statute, and not making it up. And that's what drives the Democrats crazy. Let me, before I conclude, let me just tell you a couple of other things that folks have said about Walker. When he was nominated to the district court, more than 100 of his law students wrote to the Judiciary Committee to talk about, quote, his concern and compassion that he shows for students, his commitment to diversity and equality, his humility, his open-mindedness, and his ability to teach and inspire. Similarly, more than a dozen of his faculty colleagues wrote to the committee, and this is really an important point. They said there is a greater need than ever for thoughtful, open-minded judges whose work creates both the perception and the reality of being willing to engage with those who have differing perspectives. Justin has always been exactly that kind of colleague, and we have no doubt he will be that kind of judge. And they added that he has all the qualities of intellect, industry, thoughtfulness, and temperament that are essential for a judge, and particularly essential for a court like the DC Circuit, which is, you know, not only the second most important court, but the second most intellectually challenging court after the Supreme Court.
And I'm just going to add here, one thing that strikes me as particularly peculiar about the argument that he's not qualified is, what does make someone qualified for the DC Circuit? The DC Circuit has a very unique caseload. The cases are, from a range of administrative law topics, so separation of powers and executive authority. There's no real preparation for that. But if anyone has that, I would say it's Walker, as he was now Justice Kavanaugh's clerk on the DC Circuit. So I think he's as prepared as anyone could be for that role.
Well, certainly. I clerked for the Sixth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and that's the closest you're ever going to get to being a judge. And he didn't just clerk for the U.S. Court of Appeals. Walker also clerked for the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So that's being a clerk is probably the best training to be a judge. And being a law professor is probably, the second best training. It's the same type of intellectual exercise that you have as an appeals court judge. So that alone gives him great experience. And, also, I think everyone agrees that he has a brilliant legal mind. Again, you don't accomplish at a young age what he's accomplished without a brilliant legal mind. And again, there are other circuits where you could probably get away without being a top-notch legal mind. You can't do that on the DC Circuit. So, they say that he doesn't have, courtroom experience. That might be relevant to some degree as a district court judge, although he's been a good district court judge in the short time he's been there. But on a circuit court, again, you're looking for the type of experience you get as a law professor, as a clerk, and you've got to have a brilliant mind, and Walker has that.
I agree. My point is more that the unique nature of the DC Circuit, there's just very little that will prepare anything for that. Naomi Rao was very prepared, but she had never been a judge. A judge from any other lower court, though, they will not have dealt with the type of cases that they will deal with in the DC Circuit. Can you break down?
Let me just remind everyone again, not only was he a law professor, but he was a law professor writing about the very issues that tend to come before the DC Circuit. Mm-hmm. I don't know, how much better prepared you could be to be a DC Circuit judge.
Can you break down the controversy over the ABA rating? His first ABA rating, he was due to his lack of trial experience. Is that right? And is there going to be another rating? Not that those particularly really matter anyway. Those are pretty biased, but if you could explain what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, the ABA has a well-known liberal bias when it comes to rating judges. So I don't know at least that Republicans are going to put much emphasis on it. And I assume there will be another rating. There typically is, especially because this is evaluating him for a different court. The main thing the ABA focused on the last time was just the fact that they require 12 years of experience. And since he's young, he didn't have quite 12 years of experience. Although, if I remember, they did say that they did concede that he clearly had the credentials that would make him a great judge. That they were questioning whether he was quite ready for it at that time.
And another thing that's being pointed out is his opinion from, I believe, about 2 or 3 weeks ago regarding the ability for churches to congregate in light of the shelter-in-place orders. Do you want to kind of go into that a bit? I know we don't have time to do a full breakdown of that opinion, but it would probably be helpful to give a bit of an overview.
Sure. There have been a few cases like this across the country where governors or mayors, in this case, the mayor of Louisville, tried to stop church services, even if they were parking lot services where people were appropriately distanced. There's some debate over the facts here, whether the mayor banned them from having such a service on Easter or just strongly encouraged them not to. But either way, they were afraid that they were going to wind up being arrested. And Walker wrote a very strong opinion talking about how sort of otherworldly it was that, that the mayor and, as I say, other mayors and governors were trying to ban people from a safe religious gathering when liquor stores were open and, you could park in the parking lot of, retail stores, but somehow you couldn't park in the parking lot of a church. And this is what I mean about, Democrats don't like him because he's, has an unabashed, conservative judicial philosophy. And he, talked about the history of religious persecution, but, also talked about the centrality of religious liberty. It's right there in the First Amendment. That takes precedence over, there's nothing in the Constitution about governors or mayors being able to suspend the Bill of Rights or any other part of the Constitution in an emergency. But the First Amendment, its protection of religious exercise, is right there in the First Amendment. And Walker issued a TRO, and of course the liberal press jumped all over him for doing it, but I think it was the right decision.
So going back to what's happening in the Senate right now and what might happen in coming weeks, you see a lot of commentary about how McConnell should be reconvening the Senate for nominations. Of course, no one protested it this morning when the Senate confirmed the new Inspector General to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. These are just routine nominations that are being processed. I don't see what's, out of the ordinary, and it's not as if they're passing legislation, otherwise. What do you see happening in the next few weeks, and do you think, our current situation will slow down the process of getting him confirmed?
Well, look, the Democrats were going to make a fuss about Walker and, frankly, other judicial nominees, no matter what happened. Especially because we're nearing the end of Trump's first term, and whatever hopes they have of taking back the presidency, they're, salivating over the possibility of keeping some of these vacancies open for a Democratic president to fill. So they'd have an excuse. Their next excuse after COVID-19 will be the so-called Leahy or Thurmond rule, which is, oh my God, we're getting too close to the end of the term. We can't confirm any more judges. But, as to the COVID-19 excuse, the Senate can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's no reason why, while the Senate is taking care of COVID-19 related business, they can't also be holding Judiciary Committee hearings for judicial nominees and other nominees. It's just an excuse. I don't take it seriously. And I think now that the Senate is back, assuming there's not another COVID-19 recess, I think McConnell is committed to, moving ahead firmly on confirming judges. And I think Graham is committed to moving ahead on hearings. And, McConnell has said, look, if we have to do this, into November and past November, we'll do it.
Yes, and as a reminder, the hearing is tomorrow at 10 a.m. And that hearing, by the way, will pretty much function the same as any Judiciary Committee hearing would, despite coronavirus. I'm not sure if some are maybe telephoning in. How is that going to work any differently?
Well, I think there's not going to be the crowd.
No protesters.
Yeah. But yes, no protesters. And, you laugh, but we've seen in recent years, I don't remember all the costumes they wore, handmaiden costumes, hats, various things. So that will be lacking. And that may be a good thing. But, it's not, the Democrats will do their part to make it clear that they're not happy with the Walker nomination. And again, maybe they'll be honest. Maybe they'll just say, we don't like Walker because, he's young and he'll be on the court for a long time, and because he's unabashed about his conservative judicial philosophy. I'm trying to think what else they don't like. They don't like the fact that he's been clear that he thinks that the Obamacare case was wrongly decided. That's the one where Roberts switched at the last moment to save Obamacare. So, they're not going to defeat Walker, but even if they did, Trump would appoint another conservative and they would be just as unhappy.
So we only have a few minutes left. I think, unless you have any concluding thoughts, I think now would be a good time to open up the floor for any questions. Kurt?
I guess my concluding thoughts are that, this is really one of Trump's most important nominations. I mean, of course, Supreme Court nominations are the most important, but the DC Circuit nominations are second most important. And he's done a great job so far. I mean, Greg Katz's Naomi Rao and Justin Walker. I mean, I don't know how much better you could do in terms of judicial philosophy and just legal brilliance. So, you know, I know he gets most of the kudos from conservatives on the Supreme Court, but Trump deserves equal kudos for the DC Circuit.
And I would point out to the audience, by the way, in the email that you received from the Committee for Justice with this panel, there's also a 1 or 2 page kind of handout with an overview of his record that we thought some people would find helpful. And does anyone have any questions? I know it's kind of early on, so there might not be as many since this was just announced as a certainty this morning. Anything? Okay. Well, I think that's it. We're almost out of time. So if anyone has any sort of follow-up, feel free to reach out to either of us via email. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.